Hi, I'm Dr. Durusha, the founder president of the PCOS Society of India. The society is of multidisciplinary experts in the field of gynecology, dermatology, endocrinology, and all the allied specialists who look after PCOS women. We all are focused on creating awareness on PCOS, both amongst doctors and updating their knowledge. And we are also wanting to create the awareness amongst women at large for them to understand what they are having and what their problem is. In short, our organization is consisting of experts both from India, and we also have members from outside the country. It's important for all of you to be with us and join us in our endeavor to upgrade our knowledge in this field and reach out to our patients so that they have a better quality of life in future. Thank you.
Dr. Sujata, Dr. Lipika, you can start.
You're sharing the screen?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, very good evening to one and all. I welcome you all to yet another W3 series. The topic for today's discussion is the art and science of controlled ovarian hyperstimulation in infertile PCOS women. The convener moderator for the session is Dr. Sujata Kar, and our experts today are Dr. Padmarekha, Dr. Krishna, Dr. Padmaja, and Dr. Shravani. Can we move on to the next slide? Yeah, next one, please. Yeah, it's a proud privilege to introduce Dr. Durusha. She's the Director Gynae World, the Center for Women's Health and Fertility, Mumbai. She's the founder president of the PCOS Society of India. She's the founder trustee for Women's Empowerment Foundation. She's the trustee and past president of MOGS. She's the chair of the Special Interest Group on Reproductive Endocrinology and PCOS at Aspire. She's the international advisor of the Special Interest Group of ISHRE, and she's the past president of ISAR, FOXY, and IMS India. She's also the past director of the Digital Education International Menopause Society. It's my honor to introduce the moderator and convener of today's session, Dr. Sujata Kar. She's the director of Kar Clinic and Hospital Private Limited, Bhubaneswar. She's the honorary treasurer of ISAR. She's also a managing committee member of the PCOS Society of India. She has been the best graduate of a batch and has seven gold medals to her credit. She's also credited with the first IVF baby of Eastern Orissa and the first laser hatched baby of Orissa. She has bagged several awards to her credit. Her center has been awarded the best IVF center in Orissa for the last 2 years. She has the Brand Icons Excellence Award of 2018. She has been awarded with the Parichaya Award for Woman Achiever Orissa 2019. She's also been awarded the Devi Award for Dynamism and Innovation from Chief Minister of Orissa. She has published 14 original publications related to PCOS and male fertility, and she has authored several chapters for books and contributed to newsletters and reviews. Ma'am, I would request you to please take the session forward.
Thank you very much, Lipika. So it is really a proud privilege, and it's my honor that I have got a chance to be a moderator and convener of this W3 series, which is such an innovative idea from our president, Dr. Durusha. The PCOS Society is doing so much innovative and cutting edge and different kind of workshops that it is really good that I have got a chance to do this. So I'll introduce our experts to you today. Our first expert is Dr. Padmarekha Jarge. Apart from being a very good friend of mine for many years, she's the scientific director of Sushrut Assisted Conception Clinic of Kolhapur, and she's a managing committee member of PCOS Society. And the most important, she's been an editor-in-chief currently of the Journal of Human Reproductive Sciences. She's reviewer of many journals of assisted reproduction. And she's very actively involved with the Maharashtra chapter of ISAR, being the executive vice president currently. and also very intimately associated with the Fertility Preservation Society of India. And she has many original publications to her credit when she was working as a fellow in Glasgow, and also now once she has come back to India in Human Reproduction, Fertility, Sterility, and Journal of Human Reproductive Sciences. If I'm not wrong, I think her special interest lies in AMH and ovarian reserve. The next expert is Dr. Krishna. He's the scientific director of Oasis Center from Hyderabad. He's a clinical embryologist who's qualified from Monash University, Australia. He's got a diploma and he's an MBBS from Bangalore. But you know, I remember him as a very enthusiastic and very knowledgeable embryologist whom I meet every year in ISAR and ACE, and somebody who comes across as the right person to talk about embryology and the right person to be giving you know, information to clinicians practicing art. Our next expert is Dr. Padmaja. She's also been a good friend, and she's from Hyderabad, Vijayawada actually. She has got many awards, and I think during undergrad as well as post-graduation in OBGYN from the Rama Memorial Gold Medal and G.N. Mathur Prize in Physiology. And currently she's the chairperson of the ISAR Andhra Pradesh chapter. She's the secretary of APOG Society. She's been the organizing chairperson of South Zone Yuva Foxy, and she's been a very active member of VOGS. Our next expert is Dr. Shrabani Mukherjee. She's a scientist who works with the National Institute of Research in Reproductive Health, which is a ICMR institute, a very reputed institute in Mumbai. Her academic background is that she's a PhD from the Indian Institute of Chemical Biology, and she's got her main research interests are molecular pathogenesis of polycystic ovary syndrome. She's got many awards, the ICMR awards, as well as a couple of awards that she's worked in USA. She's also got a research fellowship to work in USA for a couple of years. She's got a UGC fellowship, a very prestigious fellowship from the UGC in the year 1988 and 89, and Parmal Bikas Award by the Department of Physiology when she was doing her MSc course. So yeah, she's a scientist of a good repute, and I know her as somebody we catch up with a lot of academics during our ASRM sessions while attending ASRM, and also while attending various meetings and conferences of PCOS Society. And it's really nice that she's with us because she'll give us some insight on basic science. Us clinicians don't really put too much of our head into, understanding basic science and knowing the pathophysiology of polycystic ovary syndrome. And finally, it's a real pleasure to introduce Lipika. You've already met her. She's such an enthusiastic, sweet, and well, she's now pretty senior. She's a managing committee member of PCOS Society, but I see her as that little girl, who's been doing postgraduate for a pretty long time. And so she introduced, she will now present the case for today. Lipika, if you could go ahead.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for the introduction. Okay, so I'll just share the screen.
Just 1 minute, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Yeah, so moving on to our first case. She's a 28-year-old female, a case of primary infertility. She's married for 9 years. She's a known case of PCOS with irregular menses. She has clinical features of hyperandrogenemia and a polycystic ovarian morphology on ultrasound. She's an IH type, classic type of PCOS. Her BMI is 34.7. She has tried several cycles of ovulation induction with IUI at multiple centers elsewhere. There's no male factor present in the couple. She's referred to us for IVF. Her AMH is 15.4 nanograms per ml. On day 2, the AFC antral follicle count was around 25 to 30 per ovary. The ovarian volume in the right ovarian volume was 24.6 ml, and the left ovarian volume was around 28.4 cc, and there was no existing metabolic disorders. She was started on metformin 1750 milligrams per day. She was started on pre-IVF lifestyle changes and medications. She was advised a calorie-restricted diet and aerobics along with weight training as an exercise schedule. She was followed up after 3 months of these pre-IVF strategies, but there was no significant weight loss that was observed. No changes in AMH levels were noted. She was started on ANTAC protocol, 150 international units for 7 days, but no response was observed on scan. Then she was put on 225 international units for another 7 days, but no follicular growth was seen on even 225 international units. And then she was put on 300 international units for another 4 days, yet no response was observed. So the patient failed to respond to 300 international units after a stimulation of around 20 days. So I'll just mention the details of the IVF2 IVF cycles. She was put on a standard IVF cycle with 450 IU starting dose and then step down antagonist protocol. 26 oocytes were recovered on pickup, out of which 18 were M2 oocytes and only 4 blasts were formed on day 5. Fresh transfer was planned for this patient with estrogen and progesterone coverage, but she was not pregnant. Another subsequent FET was done on a subsequent cycle, but she was again not pregnant. In the second cycle, 41 oocytes were recovered, out of which 16 were M2 oocytes, but only 3 of them were blasts. All the blasts were frozen, and a FET was planned subsequently. The pregnancy was unfortunately an anembryonic pregnancy. And on second FET of the second IVF cycle, now there is an ongoing pregnancy. Sujata ma'am?
So thank you, Lipika. Thank you, Lipika. If you can stop sharing, I'll share my screen.
Ma'am.
So, dear panelists, welcome to our panel discussion today. As we know that we are going to talk about the art and science of controlled ovarian stimulation or ovarian stimulation in the infertile PCOS woman. Now, the case that Lipika presented is certainly a unusual case. So we are supposed to discuss various aspects of ovarian stimulation in PCOS, and in the background also we will keep in mind that this particular case that Lipika presented. So to give you a little bit of a background, we know since Thessaloniki consensus of ASRM ESHRE, which was in Greece 2007, that the infertile PCOS, the first line treatment is preconception care and lifestyle changes. The second is oral ovulogenics. Third is gonadotrophins or laparoscopic ovarian drilling. And fourth is IVF. So it is actually a very small group of infertile PCOS women who will actually need IVF. If we go by a survey, just about 1% will probably need if ovarian, if anovulation is the only cause of infertility. So very small percentage will require IVF. But in our IVF cohort of patients, about 33% of women will be the hyper responder type, whether they are PCOS or PCOM morphology, or they are just hyper responders. So this is a sizable chunk of women who will have, who are hyper responders. And we know that IVF in this category of patients, the hyper responders, is always a challenge. It is a very fine walk between an over response and an under response. So one needs to have a lot of maturity while doing an ovarian stimulation in this category of patient. There are a lot of challenges, how to do pre-IVF workup, which protocol should be used, what should be the starting dose of FSH, how to titrate the FSH dose so that we get an optimal response, how to prevent OHSS, how to avoid cancellation. But more important, the excessive ovarian response in PCOS very often leads to a lot of immature oocytes, low fertilization rate, etc., and often the IVF results are not very good. So let us look at each of these individually and see how far we can, kind of have a clarity for our audience today. where ovarian stimulation is concerned. Padmaja, are you back?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay, great. So as you saw the case that Lipika presented, that was a kind of a difficult patient. She'd gone everywhere and not got pregnant, and it was quite a few years of her marriage, and she'd come for IVF. So in this category of patient, or for any patient of PCOS, it's important that we pre-IVF optimize this patient. What are your thoughts? How would you consider a pre-IVF optimization?
As you rightly said, polycystic ovary is it's the concordrum, and it is the end result of a lot of metabolic processes that are going wrong. So in them, they have an abnormal hypothalamo-pituitary axis function. They have high pulsatile LH. They have almost 60% of our people are obese. Even the lean have visceral obesity, where there is insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, and with the added element of hyperandrogenism. And almost 1/5 of our patients are hypothyroid. And if it is not a corrected hypothyroidism, they have associated hyperprolactinemia, which further wreaks havoc on the hypothalamo-pituitary axis and function. And nowadays we are having a large number of people, they're stressed out for everything in life. And especially women of PCOS, you know that they've always been chubby, overweight, which was considered cute and baby fat. And then they turned into adolescents. They got into a college where they're studying for 10 to 12 hours, no physical activity, only studying, and they put on lots of weight. They have psychological issues because they would have tried so many weight loss programs and still not succeeded in losing it. They also know that they need to lose weight. They will have a sort of abnormal eating habits because they're starved half the time, some of them going for binge eating. So we have to consider all these aspects before we really put them on a stimulation. So yeah, they already know about lifestyle modification. It is just that we need to reinforce that, tell them the caloric value of each food so that we motivate them to stick on to a diet program, exercise program. And I believe that as was rightly done for this lady, metformin does help. And
are there any tests you will do to exclude metabolic disorders? Routine tests that you will do it?
In all women, doing a oral glucose tolerance test is the basic one. So fasting 75 gram glucose 2 hours. If they're not willing to wait for the 2 hours, we do at least a HbA1c, but it is still a optimal thing. It is always better to load and do it because that is very specific. Yeah. And these people, because they have a lot of lipid profile abnormalities, I tend to do a lipid profile in them, although directly in association with this. And as I said, we always do a thyroid function test and a prolactin. And we do an FSH-LH ratio because very high LH levels, very high AMH gives us a warning that this lady is going to be difficult to stimulate.
Okay. So what about, do you believe in doing a vitamin D test? Because that's also a metabolic, parameter.
I don't, since 99% of Indians who are not on supplement have vitamin D deficiency, I'd rather supplement vitamin D rather than do a test because the test costs 2,000 and the treatment costs only much lesser than that.
Right, right. So I guess that covers quite a bit of, the pre-IVF things that you would do. Dr. Padmarika, do you think the PCOS phenotype matters where ovarian stimulation is concerned? Because we know PCOS is such a heterogeneous disorder. And if nothing else, we have 4 phenotypes according to Rotterdam. What would you say? Because generally clinicians don't bother with the phenotypes when they're clinically managing a patient.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on, Sujata. First of all, thanks for your kind introduction and also for having me on your panel. But as you very rightly said, once we make the diagnosis of PCOS, we don't actually subgroup them as phenotype A, B, C, D as far as clinical management is concerned. But we do know that there is an increasing amount of evidence to show that there is a subtle difference in the behavior of these 4 phenotypes as far as ovarian stimulation is concerned. For example, phenotype A, which has all the 3 elements of oligomenorrhea, the polycystic ovarian morphology on ultrasound and hyperandrogenism or biochemical hyperandrogenemia, they are more likely to have very high estrogen response to ovarian stimulation. They're also more likely to grow excessive number of follicles, and hence are at the highest risk of they also will have more oocytes compared to other phenotypes, and also more likely to have more embryos to freeze, but are also at the highest risk of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. So this is very important to clinically significant ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. So I think remembering this helps us as to what dose we are going to start them with and how we are going to handle them during stimulation. Now coming to the phenotype B, where there is predominantly hyperandrogenism and oligomenorrhea, they are more likely to have very high AMH and are more likely to be resistant to stimulation.
Yes.
And hence,
I'm so happy you talked about this phenotype.
Yeah. So that is why, it is important compared to the third and fourth, that is phenotype C and D, who are hyperandrogenism and polycystic morphology, or oligomenorrhea and polycystic ovarian morphology. They are less likely to go through extremes of response.
Correct. Right. Thank you, Padmarekha. Again, Padmarekha, I would like to ask you, because Padmaja mentioned about metformin. Do you add metformin to every PCOS woman who's undergoing IVF? If yes, then what is the dose and how long do you add? Practically, how do you do it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't add metformin to everybody who is diagnosed as PCOS, but if they reach the stage...
everybody, sorry to interrupt, everybody who's undergoing a IVF.
Yeah, so I was coming to that. If they have to go through IVF, then yes, I would add metformin. I think there is reasonable evidence to suggest that it does reduce the incidence of extremes of responses and severe ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. There is some individual center studies showing that the reduced risk of miscarriage in women who receive metformin. So for that reason, I do, whether they have an element of proven insulin resistance or not. The dose I use is I start with 850 milligram OD for a week and then counsel them regarding all the possible side effects and step it up to 850 milligram twice a day and maintain it through the treatment.
And the duration?
I start at least about 6 weeks before the planned treatment, at least. And I would continue through stimulation and in the early part of pregnancy, if they do achieve pregnancy. If suppose somebody is on metformin for longer than 6 months and have not achieved the desired result, then I would review and decide whether it is making
continue or not.
Whether to continue or not. Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect. So this is for Dr. Krishna as well as for all our clinicians also. Now, giving a oral contraceptive pill or sometimes giving progesterone as a pre-treatment for PCOS women or otherwise any IVF patient is very, very common amongst clinicians, because we do it to cycle, to time our cycles and to, very often to have the, synchronization of the cohort. So OC pill giving is a very common part of, preparing a patient for IVF. Do you think that has any impact on the oocyte, embryo quality or endometrial receptivity? What is the evidence that we have currently?
Right. So even when it comes to embryologist life, it gets very easy when it's badged and done with OCP. Our lives also get easy, but let's talk about the evidence. So oocyte and embryo, whether it's OC pill pre-treatment or progesterone treatment, I don't think there's any evidence to say that the quality would come down. But there's enough evidence, RCTs and meta-analysis would say that the endometrial receptivity, the implantation rates, both in fresh as well as the cumulative outcomes are low when you've done a OC pre-treatment. So the current evidence, 2017 is the largest RCT and followed by another RCT in 2020. Both have shown that the implantations and the live birth rates are going to be less when you've done a OC pill pre-treatment. Coming on to the other side, progesterone pre-treatment, I think that is something that's really catching up. It has shown some positive and good outcomes. And currently at our center, Oasis, we're doing a RCT on this, where we're doing a PPOS, of a progesterone pre-treatment versus a clomiphene treatment while you're doing a stimulation. Too early to
What
give
do you
out.
mean clomiphene treatment? You get a withdrawal with a
Yeah, they're trying to do a RCT with that, because we've always found that progesterone pre-treatment seems to be giving us a better outcome, but we didn't want to just give out anecdotal thing and say that it worked with us. So we wanted to do a randomization, and so far, again, it's only been 8 months that we're going through this. It's a 3-year study, gone through an IEC, and we do see that progesterone pre-treatment is giving out good outcomes, but I'll hold on till the final inference comes. So take home,
right.
I think oocytes and embryos, I don't think there's much of an impact, but I think the uterine endometrium, the
The
implant.
live birth rates and the pregnancy rates are impacted. So, Padmarekha, do you or do you not give OC pill to time your cycles in PCOS women or otherwise?
No, I don't use oral
Then-
contraceptive pill. I think there is.
How do you use? You use a progesterone?
I do use progesterone, and I'm very comfortable with it. Or we can use estradiol as well. But
Okay,
the
so when
problem
you use estradiol, it will be only estradiol
yeah, only estradiol.
and
In the
you'll wait
second
for
half
a
of the
washout
cycle,
period?
I think with about 5 days, from the last pill. But one of the common problems we encounter is they start spotting towards the many
Yes.
start spotting. So it becomes a little confusing for both the patients and the team as to what's happening. So progesterone that way works out very comfortably.
Right. Padmaja, what about you? Do you use a OC pill or a progesterone, or have you
I
stopped
don't
using
use-
OC pill?
Not OC pill. I use an estrogen with a progesterone of dydrogesterone withdrawal quite frequently. I feel that is one, or a natural progesterone along with an estrogen, because as Dr. Padmarekha said, they're also anxious. They will miss one pill, and with metformin, it increases the GI motility. So when we give them low dose estrogen pills, I feel sometimes the bioavailability of just one tablet of 2 milligram is not good enough. So they have that little spotting. They'll come back after 14 days, and then you don't know what to do, and again postpone the whole thing. So I give a proper estrogen, and then I give whatever they're comfortable with, either a natural progesterone or a dydrogesterone in the last 7 days, get a withdrawal, or start off after 5 days pill-free interval.
Okay. So I think it will be fair, Padmarekha, to kind of give a opinion from our panel that clinicians per se should start thinking seriously about oral contraceptive pill pre-treatment before IVF cycles in PCOS, because they are likely to reduce live birth rate, right? I'll also show some, evidence like I've said. Okay, so what we have covered till now, I'll very quickly summarize for our audience. As a pre-IVF optimization for all PCOS patients, we should check for metabolic issues. We should check the PCOS phenotype. If nothing else, no need to classify detail for Rotterdam or otherwise. We can just check whether they are hyperandrogenic or not. Induce some lifestyle changes as far as possible. Add metformin, and oral contraceptive pill is a big question, but probably it is more evidence that it is detrimental to live birth rate, unless we are doing a frozen embryo transfer. Now, metabolically, like Padmaja has said, we should be checking hypertension, hyperlipidemia, hypothyroidism, and vitamin D, etc. Increase weight loss, some exercise, alcohol, smoking, etc. PCOS phenotypes, like you correctly said, is really important where ovarian stimulation is concerned. Like this review has said, that to classify PCOS phenotypes at diagnosis might help clinicians to identify patients who are at high risk for OHSs, customize therapy, and subsequently plan a trigger. Also, to give a short brief, phenotype A, which is phenotype which has the complete phenotype, complete 3 parameters of PCOS. They have greater serum estrogen, greater number of follicles. They respond best to agonist trigger. They have a very high AMH, and they are at the highest risk of OHSs. B requires usually a very high doses of gonadotropins compared to others. Phenotype C requires lower doses of gonadotropin. Phenotype D have high AMH, high AFC, and high E2, and they are also at high risk of OHSs, but not as high as phenotype A. Okay, and metformin, like Padma Rekha said, it should be added. The evidence tells us, this is the Cochrane review that tells us about 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams per day, at least 2 months before IVF, can be given anytime from 3 to 12 months before and during cycle. It has very good evidence. The only evidence that is currently lacking is whether it acts best for obese or non-obese women. The current evidence seems to say that it acts better for non-obese patients compared to obese. But in any case, we will add it for everybody. Oral contraceptive pill, like Dr. Krishna said, that this is the Cochrane review of 2017. It shows that oral pill pre-treatment was associated with a reduced rate of live birth rate compared to no treatment. And then there is another excellent review, excellent paper, Fertility Sterility 2020, which Dr. Krishna sent me, which compares, live birth rate following cumulative live birth rate and frozen embryo transfers. They showed that the live birth rate was significantly lower in women who used OC pill, although after frozen embryo transfer, they were almost, kind of pretty similar. And cumulative birth rate also, the live birth rate was less. So if at all we are using oral pill, maybe it is best in the setting of a frozen embryo transfer. This was another similar study he reported in 2017, which tells us that compared to spontaneous menses, progestins and OC pill, spontaneous menses is the best. And oral pills have the lowest live birth rate, and progestins are, kind of in between, but they are much better. So let's move on to our next segment. And this we'll start with Dr. Padmaja again. So there is, this concept of zero OHSS was, propagated by Paul Devroy's group that said that we should start doing a segmented IVF for PCOS women, or even if in normoresponders, and it is catching on in many parts of the world. What do you do, your practical opinion? Do you think that all PCOS and hyperresponders should have a segmented freeze-all cycles? Padmaja.
All PCOS, I don't go for freeze-all. In fact, I don't go for freeze-all as a routine protocol.
Let's talk about PCOS only.
So in all PCOS, I don't do freeze-all. There was a very good study by Humaydan and all who showed that only when the number of oocyte cumulus complexes picked up are more than 20, the risk is very high. If they're less than that, on the day of the trigger, if I have less than 18 follicles of 10 mm, then I do not go for a freeze-all. I give my trigger and I do go for fresh embryo transfer. And I freeze all the supernumerary.
So your cutoff is around 18 oocytes,
18.
mature oocytes. If you are expecting anything more than 18, you will do a freeze.
I will consider.
You'll give
in those people also, because the freeze, then thaw, although the pregnancy rates are good, the duration of treatment is so high and the cost of therapy increases so much. So if the woman does not have symptoms of OHSS, even after by day 5.
How will you know this is, sorry to interrupt, how will you know the symptoms of OHSS? You'll know it much later.
No. The earlier OHSS, we will know. I will put the embryos for blastocyst culture and I will keep monitoring her in the hospital.
Okay.
If she's very, if there is absolutely no free fluid and she's very comfortable, then I will do even a single breast transfer, but not when I have more than 20 oocytes.
Okay. So I got your thing that you said that you don't believe that every PCOS or a hyperresponder should have a segmented freeze-all. You choose your patient, and for some, you would still go ahead and do a fresh embryo transfer. Padma Rekha, what is your take on this?
I think very similar to Padmaja. What is very important, I think, in all this is we need to be prepared to monitor them more closely. When they have, when we start them with a lower dose, as the norm would be, and if they have, if they do not have excessive number of follicles, then they're very unlikely to go through hyperstimulation, and then I would be happy to.
So what is your cutoff?
cut off. It
You
is
base
not
it
the
on a day
oocytes.
2 antral follicle count or after 5 days
the-
of stimulation?
I would, take everything into cognizance, but obviously the response. So like
Okay.
Padmaja said about, it's not the number of oocytes, it's the number of follicles above 10 millimeters on the day of trigger. So if it is less than 20, and we are getting, when we do the retrieval, definitely we are getting less than 20 oocytes, then I would be willing to do an embryo transfer, monitoring her. I would prepare her for an fresh embryo transfer, single embryo, and vitrify the remaining embryos. But if there is any concern, if she develops any kind of, whether subjective symptoms of nausea, bloatedness, difficulty in respiration, any of the symptoms, even if there is no, the objective evidence, then I would be reluctant to do a fresh cycle transfer.
So actually, if we go by the Rotterdam criteria for diagnosis of PCOS,
Yeah.
I think by default, we would mean that every patient of PCOS at least would have a day 2 antral follicle count of 12, 15.
Absolutely. I mean, so,
ovary,
that
right?
is not going to guide us as to whether we would do whether we should freeze or whether we can consider fresh cycle transfer. It is actually the actual response to the stimulation which we should be looking at.
Yeah. So I would personally, I practice a little differently than what you said, because close monitoring and sometimes OHSS simply takes you by surprise. Even there are patients whom you would have got 10 eggs or 12 eggs, sometimes will land up with OHSS. So for me, for the last 3-4 years, 5 years, anybody who's a hyper responder, has a day 2 follicle count more than 10, 12 per ovary, blanket, I'll always counsel them about freeze-all cycles, and I will do a freeze-all. That's been my thing, my practice for a pretty long time. So, but you are also absolutely right. There are many who would not, but I somehow feel it is the safest wherein you can, do that.
Yeah. Well,
this is also the. You said something?
Yeah, just very briefly, what trigger we would use is also an important aspect, I think, to improve the safety of the stimulation.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
So once you use the agonist trigger, I guess you will freeze all, because I somehow will come to that a little later, because I just don't believe in that luteal phase, trying to rescue the luteal phase. I feel it just, I feel it's much easier, safer, and comfortable for me to counsel my patient from day 1 that you're going to undergo a segmented IVF. We are going to do a stimulation and get your eggs, and whatever number of blastocysts are formed, and then undergo frozen embryo transfer based on. I've been doing, somehow I feel much more safer doing that. And if you look at the new international guidelines, which is our go-to document now for every clinical aspect that we want to ask. So over here, we, as you would also agree with me, we simply do not have the evidence to say that do freeze all for all PCOS women. But here, the clinical practice point that has been mentioned, IVF in PCOS women, in IVF and ICSI cycles in women with PCOS, consideration needs to be given to an elective freeze-all of all embryos.
Yeah.
So even they recommend, the current guidelines recommend that probably to do a elective freeze-all in all women is what we should seriously think about. Okay, so now the next question, big question, is once the IVF patient is there for us for stimulation, how to decide on the starting dose of FSH? Now, we all know that there's a very narrow window below which the patient is not going to respond, and above which she's going to respond, and then you have no control to how many follicles we develop. In the patient that we presented, Lipika presented, do you think Padmaja and Padmarekha, both of you, each of you gave your opinion that she was just 28, and she, although her BMI was very high, I started her on and her AMH was like 15.4. I started her with a starting dose of 150 IU. Do you think that was okay? Padmaja?
Yeah. I think it was okay, because that's the first cycle and we don't know how she's going to respond. But usually what I do is I'll put HM gonadotrophin stimulation for IVF less than 150 is useless, because 75 you'll get a single follicle. That's my baseline. So how many negative factors she's having, I will keep adding 75 and try to juggle it around in my mind. So with higher BMI, add a little more. With a high AMH, it's a double.
So for this patient, you would have started with 225. What is your cutoff
Yes,
for
I
BMI?
would have.
Because she's
I
high.
usually 225. I would have been more comfortable, because she's having. My tendency would have been to increase, because she has a high AMH, and that pushing above that AMH is an inhibitor. So to push above is a little difficult, but having 30 antral follicles in each, I can't go above. So my plus and minus, so I would have started only with 225.
Padmarekha, what do you feel? I mean, how do you decide on the starting dose?
Yeah.
What are the parameters that we
you know, when we do not have any reference to a previously stimulated cycle with somebody with proven PCOS, irrespective of the weight. I mean, weight does play a role, and we have to bear that in mind. When I'm putting her through a stimulation cycle for the very first time, I would be very hesitant to go above 150.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind that, you know, I will have to very likely increase the dose because of her obesity. But I think it's a very safe practice to start with 150 and do any dose changes.
So
if
this is
necessary.
like pretty standard that we look at the age, BMI, AMH, day to AFC and decide
Yes.
on. But then PCOS women are pretty different, and this was that IVF worldwide survey. That what would gonadotropin would you start IVF cycle in a PCOS, and 55% said that irrespective of BMI, age, AMH, etc., most of them would be scared to put a PCOS woman more than 150 IU of FSH. But do you use any algorithm, or do you will just start them with 150? Padmaja, would you only base it on BMI and but you said you add 75 for each?
Yeah, for each negative factor, and each one that increases the risk of her OHSS, I will subtract 75. So in this lady, it averaged based again the AMH, which is very high, you need to give more. But having large number of antral follicles, you need to give less. So those two nullified, and that was
so in this the antral
25.
follicle was 30, 30, 60, almost 25.
Yeah.
I think that these, I mean, if I may just, make a comment, these nomograms are very helpful for normal responders rather than for
PCOS. Yes,
responders.
yes.
Yeah.
There is one nice, article I found. It is pretty recent, 2019, where AMH was used for FSH dosing. And they found that, because our problem, like Padmaja, you said that high AMH is a intrafollicular biomarker, which actually inhibits development of FSH receptors. So the more each follicle has AMH, the higher dosage of FSH you need. So usually, but in practice, while IVF, the higher the AMH, we tend to reduce our FSH, unless it's like ultra high, like more than 7, 8, 10, 14. So interestingly, that is why I put up this article, this paper, which says that in a high AMH group, more than 14 nanograms, almost 1/4, 26% had a low response. With whatever dose the clinician decided for that particular patient. You know what I'm getting at?
I got it.
Yeah. And also, they had OHSS because it was not a mandatory freeze-all. Just like Padmaja, you said that, based on patient to patient, you'll decide whether you'll do a fresh or you do a freeze-all. But they noted that if they had to avoid a single OHSS, they would have to stop and do freeze-all for any patient who had more than 10 follicles. So with this strategy, also they had OHSS, severe needing admission in 3 cases. And this was a pretty recent. Somehow OHSS goes underreported. Don't you agree?
That is,
Even today.
to some extent, mild OHSS is what we are really trying to get in these people. Because look at those ovarian wall sizes after.
Because I'm sure even today, even in there's so many centers, so many countries, I'm sure OHSS still happens, and serious OHSS happens a lot. And it does go unreported. So for the same, this was another very good paper with the same analysis that said that women with higher AMH will require higher dosages, whether it is oral Ovulogen or FSH or anything that you need to do. And higher AMH women have lower birth rates in PCOS. That is another point which has been now very often being shown. So here, let me come back to our patient that we showed you all, which was like not a very common patient that you will have. But as you saw, with 300 IU after almost 20 days of stimulation, I had to cancel the cycle. And then I counseled the patient. I said, something's wrong with you. I don't understand. Let me go back, do a little bit research, and we come back. And I left her for 2-3 months with metformin, weight, blah, blah, and all those things. And then I read a couple of, papers that showed us about FSH polymorphisms and all that. So we have Dr. Shrabani, who's going to talk to us about this point, which actually is a reality in any patient where you have a disparity between dosage of FSH and the expected oocytes that you get. But when you have very high dosage of FSH and still a very poor response, we have to think about FSH polymorphisms. So Shrabani, you are a basic scientist doing a lot of research on PCOS pathogenesis. Tell us a bit about what is FSH, LH, AMH receptor polymorphisms, and how it can impact ovarian stimulation.
Hi. I would like to thank first the PCO Society and Dr. Durusha and Dr. Sujata Kaur for having me here. So you all know that the pharmacogenomics is a very promising approach to develop the tailor-made treatment. And in case of ovarian stimulation, it is very important. So the most of the important candidate genes people have studied are the FSH beta, LH beta, FSHR receptor, and LHCGR receptor. And the promising result came from the FSHR receptor. So there are 3 common polymorphisms present in the FSHR receptor. 2 are in the coding region and 1 in the promoter region. So in our institute, Dr. Mahale's group, they worked on this, all these 3 receptors, and they have some Indian data. And I will compare their data with the a meta-analysis which has compared lot many other 18-19 papers. So first polymorphism is T307A. That is the changing amino acid at 307 position of the FSHR receptor from threonine to alanine, from a polar amino acid to a non-polar amino acid. So what Dr. Mahale's group reported that the women who are having AA genotype, that is the polymorphic alanine genotype, they require much less FSH. They are more sensitive, and the duration of the FSH is much lesser.
Okay.
And their estrogen level was much higher. The number of oocyte retrieved were higher, and interestingly, 86% of this woman develop OHSS.
I see.
So, and there are also a meta-analysis by Alvigi et al. In 2018 recently, and he compared this polymorphism, which are having published in 7-8 papers. They have not seen any difference in the FSH response, and they observe that the duration for the A genotype are really shorter compared to the other genotype. So this means that
what percentage of Indian women would be having that genotype?
So genotype distribution is almost similar between the polymorphic and the non-polymorphic. Heterogeneous genotype is more. Homozygous and polymorphic homozygous are almost same. Means wild type and polymorphic are almost same, but the heterozygous population are more. The homozygous polymorphic population, 86% develop OHSS. So they are more prone to, they're more sensitive. So if they develop, they have higher E2 level and higher number of oocyte, and this is in the general population, not in the PCOS women specifically.
Okay.
So coming to the next polymorphism, that is N680S, that is asparagine 680 position to serine. This also Dr. Mahale's group reported that there is no difference in the FSH administration and the duration of the FSH treatment. But the polymorphic group, the SS group, the serine group, they have E2 level was not high. The E2 level was not high, but was high but not significant. And of this 50% women, they develop OHSS. But as the number of this SS women are very less, they are not very common. So only they got 6, and out of that 3 develop OHSS. So that is not significant, but this gives a trend that our Indian woman may have a chance to develop OHSS if they have SS.
This particular.
And the odd ratio was quite high, though it was not significant. Odd ratio was 2.67. The most important polymorphism is minus 29 G2A, that is in the promoter region, which impaired the transcription of this FSHR receptor, that is the FSHR receptor.
Okay.
So in that that region have a transcription factor binding site. And Dr. Mahale's group has shown by the functional study that if the polymorphic genotype is present, the gene and the protein expression of the FSHR is significantly low. So we don't have much FSHR on the surface.
Okay.
So accordingly, this woman with the polymorphic genotype, they are poor responder. They have low level, they have low number of oocyte, and you need more FSH and all those things for the proper response. And even the meta-analysis also supported this study. So meta-analysis showed that the women who are having the GG genotype, that is a wild type genotype, they have more number of oocyte, more number of M2 oocyte, and the outcome is good.
Okay.
So if we take this 3 genotype, the 2 coding genotype, they are in the linkage disequilibrium, and the promoter region. So there are few studies that they have done a combined analysis of mainly 680 polymorphism and the promoter region polymorphism, and they have shown that if the woman is having, Dr. Mahale's group showed, if the woman is having the polymorphic A genotype of minus 29 and the wild type genotype, that is the asparagine of the 680, they are poor responder.
Okay.
So there are another study in the Caucasian woman. They also have similar results. They shown that.
So are there any of these, so what you've said is, we probably need to evolve further so that a personalized medicine, when all these things are available, we will be able to check each patient for the genotype and then decide on the dosage and, of FSH. Are any of these receptor polymorphisms available commercially?
I don't think so as of now.
I have read somewhere, and I have heard from my colleagues in Delhi that they do test for FSH polymorphisms, LH polymorphisms, and some lab in Delhi, a DNA helix or something, has it. Padmarekha, are you aware?
I think double helix probably.
Double helix is having it.
They might be doing
Krishna, you are aware of these?
Yes, they do test it. We don't know the significance in relation of that, but the testing is available now.
Yes, testing for FSH and LHR receptor polymorphisms, I believe, is available. How far that helps, I also don't know. I've never used. Okay, so that was excellent to know that the answer to a personalized ovarian stimulation will come from the genotype, isn't it, Shrabani?
Yes, yes, and this is very important. I think we need to have a overall study across the India, because we have different ethnic population and genotypes are very different. So we
Yes,
don't know which genotype in which background how they are going to respond. So
yes,
before making this is a very promising strategy, but before bringing to the clinic, we need to have a large scale study across India to
right, right.
come to a conclusion, and it will really help the clinician.
That's true. Thank you, Shravani. So, Dr. Krishna, we go over to you now. Where PCOS is concerned, again, there is a lot of talk about whether the oocyte quality is impacted, whether there is higher GV, higher oocyte wastage, higher fertilization failure. As a embryologist, what is your take on this?
So, by and large, I think PCO women do not have any effect on the oocyte quality. I'm sure a lot of people out there might be like, no, we have seen poor quality oocytes. But again, what do we define by poor? So let me take you back to the reference of the Istanbul Consensus, the Alpha Society, published in the year 2012. And they do not consider dark granular oocytes or oocytes with a darker cytoplasm as abnormal because it has got no clinical significance. If a oocyte is seen to have SERs or vacuoles, giant oocytes, a lot of inclusions in the perivitellin space, I think that is what is considered to be detrimental and might affect the whole embryo dynamics, implantations, and live birth rates. So, do PCO women really have these kind of oocytes? There could be little anecdotal reports or patients with that, but I don't really think it affects the oocyte quality. One. Second, coming to the point of would there be a higher number of immature oocytes?
Yeah.
Again, the answer is no there. In our own clinic, I would want to share with you all a experience. There was a point where we, in our normal audit meetings, the clinicians started pointing out at the lab saying that, there's higher number of immatures. Are you people really stripping it too early and all of that? And then, we all said that, probably in a PCO woman who's hyper-responded, just to kind of avoid OHSs, they have a tendency to go to smaller follicles and get them out. And that is where we have seen the GVs are going up. Then we said, request to the clinical team, why don't you retrieve all the 14 millimeters and above follicles? If at all you're going anything lesser than that, let the team be alerted so that we keep them aside. From the time we started doing this, we don't see a high number of GVs. So again, the RCTs, if we refer, also do not say that neither the quality nor the immaturity is increased in these PCO women.
What about fertilization rate? Is it?
It's no different. Your fertilization rates are no different. Their blast rates are no different. But the other bit is, if PCO women have other comorbidities, especially BMI being on a higher side, now I think that is where there could be issues with the oocyte quality, the embryo dynamics, and even the implantations being on the lower side. But if you're really looking at the pathophysiology or the way the PCO is affecting the whole HPO axis, would that affect the ovarian oocyte quality or the embryo dynamics? The answer is no. And total fail FERT or a low FERT for PCO is a rare phenomenon.
Right. So I think what you said is absolutely right. And we have no reason to believe that PCOS women have poorer quality oocytes. The same question people ask about endometriosis also, but by and large, it has been shown that, their oocyte quality or anything is not poorer. So now the next most important thing was the trigger. And now we know that, clinicians use GnRH agonist trigger in certain situations. HCG, of course, is the time tested and has been there since the beginning of assisted reproduction. So do you think giving a GnRH agonist trigger has an impact on M2 quality numbers and quality, number and quality, M2 site?
No, again.
Because there are quite a few papers that say that giving GnRH agonist trigger increases the number of M2 and increases the quality of oocytes. Do you agree with that?
Well, yes, I think I've got a mixed experience. When initially our clinicians started using the agonist trigger, and we did see some cases, but again, I think we're waiting for meta-analysis and RCTs more to come, because I don't think we've reached to that blanket statement that let's stop a HCG trigger and let's only go with an agonist trigger.
Yes,
Would the
we
real-
have not been able to show that as an evidence, but the fact remains that GnRH agonist, Padmarekha, is the most physiologically right, there was another very nice slide, I didn't put it up, which shows the exact way the LH goes up with various kind of triggers. HCG being the most unphysiological and GnRH agonist being the most physiological, right? So that is the only reason one would think that it might be in better, have better M2 quality oocytes. What is your experience, Padmarekha?
I think specifically talking about this PCOS scenario,
yeah,
that GnRH agonist trigger improves the safety of the cycle. That I think is unquestionable. And the second thing is whether it increases the number of oocytes. Yes, I think there are 3 RCTs which have shown that there is an increase in the number of oocytes. That is because in addition to, the way the endogenous LH and FSH surge happen, both endogenous LH and FSH seem to have an effect on the oocyte cumulus complex expansion and effect on the hyaluronic acid and hence separation from the follicle wall. So I think the embryologists will agree upon that. So whereas the LH kind of effect from HCG that seem to have more intracellular effect than extracellular effect. So definitely we probably will end up retrieving more oocytes. And there is some evidence that M2 oocytes might be more. But these RCTs also have addressed certain specific scenario, like where somebody has had good number of oocyte yield, but very low percentage of M2 oocytes, or those who have had a low follicular oocyte output ratio. So it's not that, in the very first cycle, all women have been put through GnRH agonist in comparison to HCG. So we have to be...
I think more of the co-responders have actually benefited, or the publications have spoken the benefits of GnRH agonist. But when speaking to PCOS per se, I don't think there's much of...
I think, the RCTs which have addressed PCOS have shown that there is an increase in the number of oocytes, which may not be something we are going to be very excited about in this scenario, but definitely does improve the number of oocytes and M2 oocytes with whatever evidence from randomized control trials is available. There has not been a meta-analysis yet on this issue.
So also Padmarekha and Dr. Padmaja, where the trigger is concerned, and since we have started doing a lot of freeze-all for PCOS and it being the safest, there are some troubleshootings also with GnRH agonist triggers.
Yes.
Sometimes there will be no oocyte. And I guess it matters a lot what the pre-trigger LH values have been, because ultimately the hypothalamo-pituitary axis has to be perfectly functioning for the GnRH agonist trigger to work to release the LH, right? Anything that you would want to say about the problems with LH, with agonist trigger?
I think there is a small, Padmaja, I think, has excused herself. So, Sujata, I will try and answer that. Yes, there have been instances. One thing is similar to problems we have faced with HCG. If the right injection and the right time is not followed, that is, something we have to be very particular about. There are many types of GnRH agonists used, and the dose finding study has been done for only 1 or 2 of them. So that is another thing, whether we are...
Maybe the dose is one, but I was, Padmarekha, hoping you to highlight the problems of giving long-term hypothalamo-pituitary suppression before starting the IVF cycle, and then landing in problem with giving a GnRH agonist trigger, which sometimes happens with OC pill
Yeah.
pre-treatment.
So I mean, because we have already addressed that issue.
Yeah,
I think that is
agree.
another aspect where it may indirectly OC pills may be indirectly affecting the success rate of the treatment cycle.
So whenever you use a GnRH agonist trigger, do you believe in doing a serum LH levels the next day?
I think 12 hours later, until we sort of develop, until we understand
Yeah.
that what we are doing is working the way it should be working, I think it is an important thing to check the LH level post trigger.
Yeah.
It is important. Yeah.
Is there a
To
cutoff
identify
that you?
an LH of above 15, I think is what is.
Yeah, 15 to 18.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would give you a comfort level that you'll probably get some oocytes.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I think we just have about 15-20 minutes left. And in this same context, what about true empty follicle syndrome? Have you actually faced it sometime, Padmarekha?
I think most of us would say that yes, at some point of time or the other, we have faced
You
it.
would have seen.
Yes.
Dr. Krishna, how often would you see it? Have you seen it?
Yes.
You're sitting in the lab and the clinician has told you you'll get 20 eggs, but you end up not having any eggs.
Yes. I think I've taken that blame quite a time. So to keep it lighter, but I think it's quite a rare phenomenon. And now with so much of double trigger, dual triggers, checking the LH. Off late, I think it's quite a rare phenomenon too.
Yeah. So Padmarekha, if you would quickly first tell us that many people don't believe that there is a genuine true empty follicle syndrome. But as a clinician, if we get no eggs,
yeah,
then what would your checklist be to make sure that it is a case of false? What would you do? Then we'll go ahead and ask Shrabani about true empty follicle syndrome.
See, one of the things what we practically do is the HCG which has been given, or the GnRH agonist which has been given, the patient has to produce that in the clinic, just to make so that we confirm that the right kind of drug has been given. Still, it doesn't rule out the fact that they may not have administered it appropriately. So if we are doing the retrieval in somebody who has responded well, and we are doing the retrieval, and as you say, we expect good number of oocytes, and if we have done about 6 to 7 follicles, the embryologist alert us if there are any granulosa cells or not in the fluid they are seeing. And if we complete one side or almost reaching completion on one side, and we haven't got any oocytes, we send some fluid for HCG levels, but we also do a follicular fluid to see the HCG levels.
Okay.
And also we just do, this is a quick check. We
urine test.
Use the fluid and do the card test to see whether there is some amount of HCG in it. So if that comes negative, it has happened only once in my entire duration of practice, very recently, with one of my junior colleagues who brought her patient for retrieval, and all parameters, endocrine parameters and ultrasound parameters normal, and inexplicably we did not get any oocytes. So we did, and for the first time we saw a negative test, and we stopped the retrieval. We gave a trigger at that time, and
again
did the retrieval subsequently, and we got
next time also it will be after 34 hours.
We did, I think, around 32 to 34 hours. 34 hours.
Get?
34 hours. And we did get 4 oocytes, mature oocytes, and she has got 2 embryos frozen out of that. So, but there are occasions where all these things come, all the checklist says that everything has gone on fine, and still we don't have any oocytes. So there is an existence of genuine empty follicle syndrome, but this is in the context of having received only one type of trigger.
So how often have you in your career seen a genuine? I have seen only once.
Yeah, I have seen
I had
twice,
no reason.
but like I had
second IVF cycle also she did not produce anything.
Yeah, I have not given double trigger in that individual. So with single 6,500 recombinant, that is 250 micrograms of recombinant HCG, we did not get oocytes twice in all this period. But as I say now, one of the treatment options for that is to subsequently stimulate them with double trigger. That is something I hadn't done in that patient. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think that still we will find that a small percentage of them will have.
Yeah, we'll have a situation where you've done everything right and she has the correct level of LH in her body to induce oocyte maturation, but yet you will not get any eggs. So Shrabani, tell us something about true empty follicle syndrome. What is the genomics of that?
Yeah, there are ample evidence that there is a genetic basis of the empty follicular syndrome. So most of the studies has been carried out in China, and they have shown that the most of the polymorphism are in the ZP1 protein. That is that has almost 22 polymorphism, which are different type: homozygous, heterozygous, compound heterozygous, which form the truncated ZP1 protein or degraded ZP1 protein or a structural change in ZP1 protein. And we know that ZP complex formation is very important, which help in communication between the cumulus and the oocyte. If that ZP protein is not formed properly, the oocyte is not going to get the nutrient, because a lot of nutrient comes from the cumulus, mainly glucose. They dependent highly on the cumulus cells. So unless the ZP protein complex is formed properly, so ZP1 having the maximum number of the mutations. ZP2 are having 3 or 4 mutation reported till now, and ZP3 2 mutation, and ZP3 and 2 mutations are mostly heterozygous mutation, and they are autosomal dominant mutation, because only one mutation in one strand of chromosome will create the empty follicular syndrome. So they are most prominent. Right. And also there are LHCG also reported to having polymorphism, mutation in one case from China and one from the Turkey. So it looks like the ZP protein is the maximum having polymorphism.
Yeah. So thankfully this is not very common because, but then, and we have no means of testing for these genotypes. So I think we have just about 15 minutes left. So we should go it a bit quickly. I think we have 2 or 3 more questions. So Dr. Krishna, day 3 or day 5 freezing?
I'll keep it short. Always a controversial, debatable topic, whether it's day 3 or day 5. Going by the Cochrane and most of the meta-analysis, if you're looking at a cumulative live birth, it's made no difference. But a fundamental thing which all of us should really think as to why are we wanting to look at a blastocyst culture. If you're really keen on putting back an elective single blastocyst, I think that should be the first reason why you should be culturing them to blast and freezing them. If you're ending up putting up 3 blastocysts, I don't think that concept is really applicable and adding any value to what we're trying to do. Is your team trained enough? Is your lab competent enough? Do you have the right support to get blastocyst? If the answer is yes, then alone an extended culture is recommended. Otherwise, I think doing a day 3 is what we should be doing. And especially if it's PCO context, if we are talking, where you're getting more number of oocytes, which means day 3, you might be having 10 plus embryos to freeze. And ideally, if you're, though not proven, if you're looking at the literature right now, people with 2 failed implantations, if they're not conceived, I think PGTA is kind of coming into the context there. So all said and done, my vote, our practice is doing a day 5 freeze because we believe in doing an elective transfer. And I think it's all about bringing the time to pregnancy down. I think we are more looking at efficiency in the cycles off late than just looking at 4 or 5 cycles and at the 4th cycle, the lady conceives. It is picking up the best embryo, giving the best chance, and preferably the first shot. That is where I think a day 5 is coming into the picture.
Yeah. So if I understood what you said, certainly day 5, we know that blastocyst will give a higher pregnancy implantation rate. There's no, I think that's pretty well shown. tell me, it's not difficult in this day and time when the culture, the lab, etc., has become so standardized, is it difficult for everybody to be doing a day 5 culture?
Absolutely no. With single step media, which is come into the picture where you do
Exactly. Things have become so streamlined and standard that it should not be. And certainly, I think day 5 freezing gives a lot of benefit. Also, where the people who, the women who will need a PGTA, etc., for them, in any case, a day 5 would be the most appropriate, right?
Absolutely.
Because we don't want to do a biopsy with a day 3.
Yeah, I think trophectomy biopsy is the one that's going to give you.
Yes. 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 And then finally, Dr. Padmarekha, what is the evidence now about cumulative live birth in PCOS with a freeze-all cycle?
I think it's very similar to normal responders.
I think this, I am basically looking for you to give some kind of a guideline to our audience and to us, that when we are planning a freeze-all cycle for PCOS women, they would have a good cumulative live birth, or whatever is the evidence that says now.
Yeah, I think it is very important to introduce the concept of not only live birth, but what we mean by cumulative live birth at the initial discussion itself, because we are transferring less and less number of embryos every time we do the transfer. So it is very important to highlight this aspect, because that improves the safety of the outcome. And as has been discussed, the protocols, lab science has become so much more effective that we can transfer single blastocysts. So we need to be looking at cumulative success rate, live birth rate per cycle, rather than just looking at one fresh cycle transfer. So this is the concept that needs to go in. What we talk about per cycle is per retrieval and not per transfer. I think there is always a difficulty for patients to understand that. They have one transfer and they would like to believe if it fails, that cycle has failed. So that has to be addressed right at the beginning. So it becomes easy to proceed with.
In our category of patients, it's difficult for us to counsel them to undergo multiple cycles of embryo transfer.
But if we are we are talking about PCOS, when we are restricting it to a PCOS scenario, when they do understand that the safety is very important, and that is why we are freezing in the first instance, and to improve the safety, like we have just discussed regarding choosing the right kind of embryos, freezing the right kind of embryos. Then I think we are in a very we're in a very safe zone to say that yes, we have selected the embryos with the best implantation potential, and hence maybe one may require more than one transfer resulting from one retrieval, but still the cumulative pregnancy rate is as good as in normal responders.
Correct.
I think, like in all the difficulties, all the challenges we have seen through years, Sujata, the more we address these situations proactively before we take them through the treatment, it tends to become the norm. So,
absolutely. So freeze-all, freezing is a technology with Krishna, you'll agree that it has really tremendously changed the entire practice of assisted reproduction in the last decade or so. So vitrification is single one technology which has contributed to a sea change in the scenario. And today, left, right, and center, people would vitrify embryos, and even for a smallest thing, they would kind of do that. So that is that. And now I think we are towards the end. So to come back to our patient, this is our last question for this patient. With regards our patient. In our patient, that patient that I showed you, I took her through 2 IVF cycles. It was a kind of a real disaster, in the sense the first time, I started her at a very high dosage of FSH 450 IU after discussing with a couple of colleagues who have faced similar situations where there are no the stimulation protocol has been bad in previous cycles. Anyway, so this was her outcome. So do you think, have you seen very often this kind of a response wherein you get lots of oocytes, but then the actual number of transferable embryos that you have are very, very low? Is there a role of PGD in these kind of patients? Is there a role of oocyte imaging that you have, all those recent ones, to, you know, check out whether there's a real problem with the oocytes or something like that?
Yes, I think we do come across such situations in our practice, especially with PCO women. So again, you know, role of PGTA with the STAR trial putting across that it might not really help. I think that has been partly our experience as well, that PGTA for recurrent implantation failure is not really changing the take-home baby rates.
Yeah.
The only place where PGTA at this point in time is holding good is to reduce the time to pregnancy. So in PCO women, if they've got anything 5 and above, that's our protocol at our clinic. We do offer them PGTA in the first cycle itself, because if they've got 6 blastocysts, which would mean they would go for 3 or 4 FET cycles, provided she's not conceiving the first or second, which means the cost is all coming closer to what I would do in a PGTA. So I rather put back a euploid embryo in the first cycle, which would give her the maximum chance of implantation. It has got its pros and cons, but if the patient understands the whole situation, and if I can offer it, I would definitely go with PGTA1.
Yeah.
Second, coming to the oocyte quality, I think we do come across these PCO women for various reasons do give very poor oocyte quality at times. And sometimes the second cycle is also like this. And this is where we have tried IVM. I think we do regularly do a lot of IVM at our clinic. We work closely with the Brazil's team and the Vietnam team. I'm not saying IVM is replacing IVF, but in people where we have not getting the right outcome, especially with PCO, I think IVF has been promising.
Yes, certainly for a small percentage of PCOS patient, in fact, that appears to be the only answer sometimes. So see, in this patient, she has undergone 5 or 6, 4 cycles of stimulation and 4 or 5 embryo transfers, and still doesn't have a live birth. So I think is stimulating PCOS women is a real challenge, and to have majority of them don't behave like the patient that we have presented. Majority of them behave nicely. You get a good number of blastocysts, and 1 or 2 cycles of frozen embryo transfer, they are pregnant. But some of them are like this, and we need to understand a little bit more about them, and then take the little unconventional path also to give them a good success rate. So if we have 5 minutes, maybe we can do we have 5 minutes? Yeah. This is just one slide. Lipika?
Yes, ma'am.
Have you read up this? If you can just talk about this patient.
Yeah, she's a patient 31 years of age. Her BMI is 41.8. She's a known case of type 2 diabetes as well as a hypertensive. She wants IVF. Her AMH is 6.7 nanogram per ml. And she's a known case of CC resistance. So the question is whether she's a candidate appropriate for bariatric surgery.
So Padmarekha, this patient is, like I have seen her from when she was 12, 13 years old. She used to study with my daughter in the convent. Always, that typical PCO looking patient. And then she's now married for I don't know how many years, 7, 8 years or something, and she's tried everything. She cannot lose weight. Now very quickly, she has even developed diabetes, hypertension and all that. And she's undergone a surgery once or twice for ovarian cyst, for appendix, all kinds of things. She has all kinds of problems. And she finally has to undergo IVF, what I'm seeing. So a little about bariatric surgery before planning a ovarian stimulation.
Yeah, I think Sujata, she's an ideal candidate for this, because she's young enough to have a good reproductive lifespan.
Yeah.
And she has all features of metabolic syndrome. So metabolically, she will benefit. and her stimulation would become safer once she loses weight, and also the chances of her her offsprings inheriting the metabolic problems will come down if her hyperandrogenic scenario comes down and her placental function improves during pregnancy because of weight loss.
That's a good point you said. We can, say that to the patient so that she might get induced to undergo.
So, I mean, it's not just the short-term benefits we are looking at. It's actually a long-term benefit for her and her baby. So, I think considering that, it has a definite role, particularly in somebody who is young enough and has a good reproductive lifespan.
Absolutely. So, in fact, like we were discussing, there are some countries who have a upper limit for BMI in which they will not do they will not take up the patient for IVF, and I think this qualifies. If she would be in the UK or somewhere, she will not be recruited for a IVF program, right?
Yeah, if it's NHS funded, yeah.
Yeah. So I think we are almost at the end of our discussion. I hope you all enjoyed. Is there any part of you feel we should talk about ovarian stimulation? Krishna, Padmarekha?
I think we've covered everything.
Yeah,
that
very methodically covered. Yeah, and also the molecular aspects as well.
Yes. So thank you very much for being part of this panel today, and thank you, Lipika. Thank you, Shravani. I'm sure that you must have thought why Sujata is wanting basic science, because clinicians generally don't generally know much about the details of pathogenesis and genetics and all that. But as the time is going to go, a time is going to come when it is all about personalized medicine. All about personalized medicine. Nobody is ever going to treat anything randomly or a blanket treatment, right?
Yes. And that will help to manage the patient also. You can adjust the dose, maybe increase and all those things.
No, for any disease, it's going to become personalized.
Very personalized, yeah.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much for being a part of this webinar.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Sujata.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, PCOS Society both for having such a very important aspect addressed and providing clarification. So thanks to Sujata from all of us and to PCOS Society for organizing this.
Right. And if the tech team can put up the slides which say what the next W3 webinar is going to be.
Sure, ma'am.
Great. And then I think we can finish off.
Sure. Just 1 minute.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. So the next one is going to be, can adjuvants assist in improving oocyte quality? This should be something really interesting. And I'm sure all our audience is looking forward to 10th April, 7 to 8:30 p.m., where Dr. Kanti Bansal is going to be the moderator and convener. Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.
Good night to all of you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, doctors, for participating, and have a great day ahead.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
You too. Bye.
There were quite a few questions,
Oh, okay.
But we never saw this.